D-Day was Sean.
So, Sean, what can you tell me about D-Day?
Well, D-Day, otherwise known as Operation Neptune, took place on June 6, 1944, on the Normandy beach. There was 2 different attacks. One was an airborne assault, and 24,000 troops landed in the Normandy Peninsula. Their job was to blockade the German forces and help the beachhead assaults. The second attack was an amphibious assault over 160,000 men, the largest amphibious assault ever. The landings took place over a 5-mile stretch. The 5 different beaches were called Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Utah, and Sword. Postponed 2 times, the actual landing of D-Day was supposed to happen on the 4th, but it was a full moon night, which would make the attack too easy to be seen. Then, on the 5th, low clouds and harsh weather made it impossible to launch attacks.
What were some of the reasons for the attack?
The reasons for the attack include the Atlantic Wall, which was Germany's first line of defense. The Atlantic Wall stretched from Norway to Spain, and it needed to be broken to allow airdrops and supply drops, with defenses that would block aircrafts and assaults from entering the land.
What happened to each of the beaches?
Well, in Sword Beach, aerial bombardment and naval artillery began at 3 o'clock, and light casualties took place. In Juneau Beach, the second highest total losses, the first wave suffered a 50% loss, but the Canadians still managed to capture the beach. In Gold Beach, 25,000 men landed. Of that, only 400 were killed. Omaha Beach, the hardest beachhead to capture, it took the American troops 3 days to capture the whole land surrounding it. 50,000 men landed there, and 5,000 died in the first hour. Utah Beach suffered the lightest casualties, only 197 out of 2,300.
Battle of the Bulge.
What can you tell me about the Ardennes offensive, Carter?
The Ardennes offensive, commonly known as the Battle of the Bulge, because it created a bulge in the Allies' fronts. The battle started December 19, 1944, and was the last attempt to split the Allies into 2 and destroy their ability to supply themselves. It was the last German offensive during the war.
What was Hitler's plan for the battle?
The 6th Panzer Army, led by Sepp Dietrich, was to lead an attack and capture Antwerp. The 5th Panzer Army, led by Montefiore, was to attack the center of American forces, capture the strategic road and rail center of St. Vith, and then drive on to Brussels. The 7th Army, led by Brandenberger, was to attack the southern flank as designated by Hitler, and to create a buffer zone to prevent American reinforcements from attacking the 5th Panzer Army. The 15th Army was to be held in reserve to counterattack any Allied attack when they took place. Hitler believed that his army could surround and cut off Canada's 1st Army, America's 1st and 9th Armies, Britain's 2nd Army, and on paper this plan was absurd, especially because Germany had been on retreat since D-Day and were low on supplies.
Geez, how did the battle start?
The battle started with a 2-hour bombardment of the Allies' line, and that followed with a huge armored attack with most of the armored German might based around Chiny Eifel.
Whose side did the battle start out for?
In the beginning of the battle, the Germans had great success, mostly due to these 3 points. The Allies were surprised by the attack. They had received little intelligence that such an attack would take place. Before the attack started, English-speaking German soldiers, dressed in American uniforms, went behind the lines of Allies and caused havoc by spreading misinformation, changing road signs, and cutting telephone lines. Those who were caught were shot after a court-martial. The weather was also in Hitler's favor. Low clouds and fog meant that the superior air force of the Allies could not be used, especially the tanks busting Typhoons of the RAF or the Mustang fighters from the USAAF, which would be used against the German tanks. Though the weather was typical for the Ardennes winter, the ground was hard enough for the military vehicles to cross and for the Sud armor attack that Hitler had planned.
Did they win the battle?
The success of the Germans only lasted 2 days. Despite hunching a bulge into the Allies' front lines, the Germans could not take advantage of it. The Germans had based their attack on a heavy armored onslaught. However, Germany did not have the quantities of fuel needed to fuel this attack. By December 22nd, the weather had begun to clear, which allowed the Allies to counterattack with the full force of their air force. On Christmas Eve, the Allies experienced the first ever attack by jet bombers. 16 German Me-262s attacked rail yards in the attempt to upset the ability for Allies to supply themselves. This bombing was meaningless, as the Germans could not use the fuel for their tanks.
Wow, how far did the Germans cut into the Allies' lines?
The Germans had advanced 60 miles in 2 days, but on December 18th they were at a stalemate. The fighting grew in intensity, and the Germans attempted to start another front in Holland. The weather suddenly worsened, with intense cold rain. Trench foot became common among the infantrymen. By mid-January 1945, the effect of lack of fuel was becoming evident, as Germans had to simply abandon their vehicles. The 1st SS Panzer Division, led by Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper, had to make their way back from Germany on foot. This unit was responsible for the Malmedy massacre.
How many people died during the battle?
The Battle of the Bulge was the largest battle that America was involved in. The 600,000 American troops, of them 81,000 were lost. The Germans lost 100,000 men and were weakened. It weakened the Nazis. They could not have won for the lack of fuel that they had, and the battle was Hitler's last gamble. One of the Germans' commandos, the Gefreiter Wilhelmina, as their leader, was captured for giving the wrong passcode. They have the rumors that Skorenzy intended to capture General Dwight Eisenhower, which meant that he had to spend Christmas isolated for days. 4 U.S. Army soldiers were killed and more were injured for being mistaken for German commandos.
That's insane. Thanks for the information. This changed how I think about World War II.
Technology and weapons with Nick.
Hey Nick, do you know any technological innovations that came out of World War II?
Yeah, Carter, there's lots. For starters, there's radar and sonar, two similar technologies. Radar was originally invented in the United States in 1940, but not for military use. Radar stands for radio detection and ranging, and sonar was invented a year later and stands for sound detection and ranging. Both of these technologies work by sending out sounds or radio waves and counting how long they take to bounce back after hitting the object. The Nazis first put the technology to use by helping land planes at night so they could attack England in the 70-night Blitz of London.
Wow, that's interesting. The Germans could actually sue the technology first, even though we invented it?
Yeah, it is, but it didn't stay that way for long. The British soon began using it to track both their own and German ships and planes. We soon followed suit. Nowadays, we use radar and sonar, and it's vital to many industries.
Nice. So what else can you tell me about?
Well, another innovation was computers, and we all know how important those are today. The first computers were used to crack and decipher codes, calculate artillery shelling, and develop advanced weapons such as the nuclear bomb.
Wow. I thought computers were invented after the war.
Well, computers, as we know today, were advanced post-war, but they existed even before World War II. Surprisingly, another super important invention was synthetic rubber. When Japan invaded China, they took control of over 75% of the world's rubber supplies. Rubber was crucial to the war effort because everything from boots to landing gear required it. The United States invented a formula called GRN, or Government Rubber Styrene, and by the end of the war, America was the #1 rubber producer.
Wow, I didn't know rubber could be so important.
Another super important invention was the jet engine. Most people think it was the Germans who first created the jet engine with the Me-262 fighter, but it's a little known fact that it was actually the British, not the Germans, that created the first jet engine back in 1938. But they invested very little in the technology due to its enormous cost.
And how important were jet engines to the war effort?
Very important, because they allowed both sides to fly farther and inflict much more damage than with traditional propeller planes. Post-war, the jet engines hit the consumer market, making a debut at the Paris Air Show in 1958. This unleashed in the era of aviation. More and more Americans began flying, and this was the golden age of aviation. Suddenly, packages, cargo, and people could make it across the world in just a day. Jet engines made transcontinental travel more affordable and far quicker. Nowadays, we are still innovating on the jet technology and making planes go faster and farther on less fuel.
Is there anything else I should know about technology in World War II?
Yes, there are a couple more important inventions. Penicillin was not actually invented during the war, but it made its debut and became readily available during the war. Penicillin is a very important drug that has literally saved the lives of millions of people, and we still use it today. Most importantly, penicillin was a step in the right direction for developing antibiotics, another major life-saving drug that we use daily.
Wow, who knew?
Two crucial weapons in the war were the V-2 rocket that eventually led to spaceflight, and of course the war-ending nuclear bomb, which began the Cold War. Lastly, there was plastic, which made its debut, replacing heavy parts that would traditionally be made of metal in things like airplanes and on the home front. Plastic wrap replaced tinfoil in order to preserve valuable metal for the war effort. Post-war, plastic manifested its way into daily American life.
Wow, I learned a lot. It's surprising that the war sparked all these inventions that are still a huge part of our lives today.
During the Second World War, the Japanese army invaded almost half of China, causing tens of millions of casualties and devastating cities and towns. The then Chinese capital, Nanjing, suffered 6 weeks of murder and rape.
Nanking by Max.
Hey Max, do you know anything about the rape of Nanjing?
The Nanjing Massacre was an episode of murder and rape in large amounts committed by Japanese troops against Nanking during the Second Sino-Japanese War. The massacre occurred during a 6-week period starting December 13, 1937. The day that Japanese captured Nanking, which was then the Chinese capital, tens of thousands of Chinese civilians were murdered by soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army. Several of the soldiers committed the acts at the time labeled as war crimes were later tried, found guilty, and were executed. China's official estimate is more than 300,000 people died based on the evaluation of the Nanjing war crimes. A small minority within both Japanese government have argued that the whole event and the death toll was military in nature and that no crimes ever occurred.
How ingrained is the denial?
Denial of the massacre has become a part of the Japanese culture. In Japan, public opinion of the massacre varies. Some few deny the occurrence of the massacre. Some say that it definitely happened.
Got it?
Yep.